I am Mark Jacobin, along with my brother James, and this is Truth and Other Lies. On this 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John Kennedy, we will examine not the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris, but Jackie herself, the woman who redefined the role of First Lady for a modern nation. Jackie was not merely the wife of a president, but a force of nature separate and distinct from the Oval Office. Join us as we sojourn through the life, trials, and achievements of Jackie B. James, what's the first thought that comes to mind when someone mentions Jackie Kennedy?
Well, who killed her husband? That's the first thought that comes to mind for me, since you're asking.
Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
How you doing, Mark?
Very good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Happy Assassination Day. The first thing that comes to mind when you think of Jacqueline Bouvier is, to me, the two very different lives that she lived. There was the life she lived as a human being prior to becoming First Lady, and then there was the very separate life and the very, legacy life that she is known for in the post-assassination world. But the first thing that comes to mind in historical context is that the wider audience, the general public, although these things are all common knowledge and available to everyone, doesn't have a grasp on who this person was prior to her marriage into the Kennedy family and prior to her elevation to First Lady upon the election of the late President John Kennedy. What's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
Her tour of the White House. Many people probably aren't aware of the tour that she gave on national television that drew several tens of millions of viewers at a time when very few people had television. And she showcased not only what she had done for the restoration of the White House, but also her refinement and skill as a person of the upper echelons of society.
Well, that's a great point. I think she unintentionally pulled off the trick of being from what we would call now the 1%, which back then, up until then, known as the aristocracy or, quote, high society, right? And able to blend that in with that fantastic education that was afforded to her by the generational wealth and success on both sides of her family into coming across as the common everyday working woman. But that wasn't by accident, Mark. What draws me to this is in her high school yearbook, I think at her third preparatory school, she wrote in her senior yearbook, at the end of it, "I don't just want to be a housewife." Now, this would have been in the 1950s, pre-women's revolution in the late 60s. So now she'd be known as a strong, independent, forward-thinking woman, and get all the well-deserved praise for that. She was doing it 2 generations ahead of time. She had it in her mind from an early age, 2 things. 1, I don't want to be an average housewife. And 2, she was going to judge herself once she became married into the Kennedy family, which she was well aware of his presidential aspirations, that she just didn't want to be judged as First Lady. And she said, and I quote, "It doesn't matter what else I do. If you bungle the raising of your children, then you're nothing." And I think that one statement tells you a whole lot about the attitude she brought into being the First Lady, which was vastly different than any woman before her in the history of the Republic, in my opinion.
And you could say that she was indeed the first supermom. As you know, Cousin Eddie was scheduled to be a part of today's episode, but he is away dealing with complications of his toad-licking habit. He was good enough to find a replacement for us. As it turns out, he has English-speaking relatives. One of them is a cousin who is going to fill in his spot today, and I would like to introduce our guest commentator today, Cousin Ashley. Ashley, welcome to Truth and Other Lies.
Hi, thank you. I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you for filling in on short notice. Ashley will be delivering a report on Jackie's impact on America and women later in the program. But first, these completely unnecessary and annoying messages.
Gargle!
Are you tired of your friends asking stupid questions? Do you wish they would shut up already? Shut them up with Gurgle, the only search engine designed by and for stupid people. Why is the sky blue? What is the square root of -1? Here, let me gargle that for you. How often should I change the air in my tires? Just how angry is Bernie Sanders? Go to www.gargle.pu to learn more. Coming soon. Get premium features with Gargle and Spit. JacobinBrothers.com is the one and only place to find Jacobin Brothers content. Register at JacobinBrothers.com to gain access to all published episodes and bonus materials. Also included with your free membership to JacobinBrothers.com is Mark's blog, cartoons, quips, and Jacobinisms. Gain access to the Jacobin catalog, which includes hundreds of episodes from shows past and present. Discover what you've been missing at JacobinBrothers.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. Ain't actually is in the dictionary, but you still should not say it. Moore's Law has not been tested in the Supreme Court. Element 115 is found on Gilligan's Island of Instability. Is this thing on? JacobinBrothers.com. Welcome back. We're talking about Jackie B. Jacqueline Bouvier, as she was known prior to her marriage to John Kennedy. And to understand who she was in the White House and why she was who she was, we need to understand where she came from. And as we've mentioned previously, she did come from rather comfortable means. James, where would you like to pick this up?
Well, Mark, I think you have to pick it up in the context to where a modern audience could understand the affluence that not only Jackie Kennedy came from, or excuse me, the former Jackie Bouvier came from, and where her family comes from, but how American aristocracy works. Let's talk about briefly George W.
Do we have to?
Just briefly.
All right.
W's middle name is obviously W. Stands for Walker, yes? Papa Bush, our 41st president, his middle name was Herbert Walker Bush. The reason for that was 100 years prior, the Walkers and the Bushes married each other, not for love, but because they each owned oil ranches. And one of the Walker Bushes decided, hey, let's marry this Walker person into the Bush family, send the dowry, and we combine two prominent families into high society. And this is how the game is played. It's almost like a monarchical marriage. And this happened frequently in the robber baron era, towards the turn of the 19th century, as these very wealthy new money families look to ingrain themselves into American society, and they use marriage as a tool. And unfortunately, now to us, this seems ridiculous, but really think of it like this. They just feed their daughters to the wealthy family to get that marriage link, such as marrying the Princess of England to the Prince of France to create a relationship, a political relationship. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Marriage as a form of creating allies transcended the European monarchies and now exists among the upper crust, the aristocracies of the Western nations.
Right. And it doesn't have the resentment attached to it today because the world is so vastly different than it was back then. This is the only example I can use. Is now switching back to the Bouvier family. Jackie's father, Jacqueline's father's name was John Vernon Bouvier, known as Black Jack Bouvier, based upon his lifestyle. And he was third generation Bouvier in America. His grandfather fought in the Napoleonic Wars. His father, and then his father-in-law, both were real estate speculators and stockbrokers, extraordinarily wealthy back in a time before inflation and there was a middle class. The wealth that I'm talking about here is on the level of a Zuckerberg or an Elon Musk. And he was the grandchild of that. So he was kind of a screw up. He became a stockbroker, but he was living on his family money. And also in that era, the way men of that stature in that time treated women, they were just vassals for childbirth. The marriage vows meant nothing. it was completely understood that if you were a woman of means or even insignificant means and you married one of these guys, that infidelity, alcoholism, and being a side piece, if you will, was part of the bargain. And he treated Jacqueline's mom like that. And she also came from high society, and she was well aware of what she was getting into. The genesis, I think, of Jacqueline's independence comes from her mother, Janet Lee, who actually divorced Black Jack Bouvier due to infidelity and alcoholism, which was well ahead of her time. They were all Irish Catholic. There was no such thing as divorce. And she said, no, I'm not putting up with this. I don't care how much money you have. I come from money too. You're out the door. But the lesson Jackie learned of that was, okay, if I want to play this game at this level, this is part of it. So the Bouvier family themselves, massively successful, as successful wealth-wise as the Kennedys. But the Kennedys had something that the Bouviers didn't, a political power base. Going back to John Kennedy's grandfather being the mayor of Boston 2 generations before he became president. And so when the Bouviers get together and they link with the Kennedys, you now have this monstrosity of wealth, influence, high society demeanor, social connections, which in this era was as important as political connections. They were pretty much indistinguishable. That would hence lay the groundwork for exactly why Jackie Kennedy would then marry the bachelor John Kennedy.
And at this point, I'll introduce the fact that the Bouviers were social acquaintances, if not business associates, with a Russian immigrant by the name of George de Mohrenschildt. This George fellow had an occasion to associate with the Bouviers, knew Jackie as a child, somewhere between 9 and 11 years old, was very fond of her, had an ongoing relationship with the Bouvier family, on and off over the years. But the name George de Mohrenschildt will come up later in later discussions in future episodes, so put a pin in that.
George de Mohrenschildt. Does that mean Bill O'Reilly gets to come in as well?
No, Bill.
This now brings us to the meeting of Jacqueline Bouvier and one John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Jackie, as we've already set up, had just a life of privilege beyond belief, but it didn't affect her egotism, or she never had an air of entitlement about her. She wanted more or less to do her own thing. However, there was something she didn't want to do. As I said before, she didn't want to be an average housewife. She always aspired to be married to a very powerful man, a man similar to her father, but just not a screw-up. Let's interject John Kennedy here. John Kennedy, a screw-up in his own right socially, a bachelor at 40 years old, a long-term serving member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Massachusetts, wants to become senator, gets elected senator, but he's not married in 1953. He'd been dating Jackie Kennedy. They were introduced by a mutual friend, a reporter, at a Washington social event. They both had decisions to make. John was under heavy pressure from old man Kennedy, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., to take over the mantle for Joseph Kennedy Jr., John Kennedy's eldest brother, killed during World War II, to take the Kennedys to the White House. This was the stated goal of old man Kennedy. He didn't look at his children as his children. He looked at them as political assets. And when the great political asset of Joe Kennedy Jr. went down into the English Channel in 1944, he moved the mantle to John. And he told John, get your crap together. Stop messing around. You're going to be president. And you need a wife. Why did John pick Jacqueline? I don't think John picked Jacqueline. I think Jacqueline picked John because she wanted to be in the seat of power. And to do this, she had to make a deal with herself. And that deal was, and I quote, a letter she wrote to a friend during her courtship with John F. Kennedy. She wrote, "He reminds me so much of my father. He loves the conquest, and he gets bored with the satisfaction. He's insecure about his own attractiveness and continues to flirt with women to feel better about himself. And then he comes to resent you, just like my father resented my mother." She nailed him perfectly, Mark, while she was dating him. She knew exactly what she was getting into. She knew about his affairs and infidelity in real time. But back then, options for women in this social class, if you wanted to take that social step up and you didn't want to, quote, be a housewife, you had to make this deal with yourself that you would get everything except a faithful husband. And she did not get one. So she made the deal. And it was well known to both of them, even at the time.
The practice of marriage for political gain lived on well into the mid to late 20th century, probably still continues at certain socioeconomic circles.
Well, this is going to sound odd, right? At the time, she was a strong, powerful, independent woman getting the most out of marriage. Now, in this day and age, you'd think this is a horrendous situation for a woman to enter into. But at the time, it was the best situation that she could enter into, and she did.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back and open up with Jackie's impact on America and women. We'll be right back. Find your favorite Jacobin Brothers merchandise at shop.jacobinbrothers.com. T-shirts, hats, and beverage conveyances all branded with your favorite Jacobin Brothers logo. You'll be shocked by how much smarter you sound debating your friends while wearing official Jacobin Brothers apparel. Shop.jacobinbrothers.com. Welcome back to Jackie B. Next up, we're going to bring in Cousin Ashley to talk about Jackie's impact on America.
Born on July 28, 1929, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier, better known as Jackie Kennedy, grew up in a wealthy, influential family in New York City. Her father was John Bouvier, and he was known as a stockbroker. Her mother, Janet, was known as a member of the upper class. Growing up, Jackie was known as an independent child with a take-control type of demeanor. Her teachers described her as smart, intelligent, and well-spoken. Jackie was a keen equestrian and had a passion for riding. She competed in many riding competitions and won an award at the Junior National Championships for horse show jumping. She also studied languages, which helped shape her role later in life in the White House. As an adult, Jackie set an example for women that style and grace were not mutually exclusive from being hardworking, intelligent, and capable. She exhibited that women can be both intelligent and strong, and that appearance did not subtract from their ability to make a positive impact on their communities. As the first of 9 ladies to hold a college degree, Jacqueline continued to show women that an education was important for all women as well. After graduating from George Washington University in 1951 with a degree in English, literature, and journalism, she actively pursued a career in journalism. She became even more well-known as a woman who was involved in her work and social causes. She demonstrated that women can be both educated and successful, and that they can contribute to society beyond traditional gender roles. Jackie continued to advocate for women's rights and education throughout her life. During her time in the White House in the 1960s, the First Lady spearheaded a restoration project at the White House. Her goal was to restore the historical integrity of the building while keeping it functional as a home and a workplace of the President of the United States. She was known for her tours of the White House. She was proud of the historical pieces she managed to get a hold of and display at the White House. She brought class and style into every project. She believed it should be a reflection of American history and heritage. This display helped cement her legacy as one of the most influential women in history. During her time at the White House, she also was an advocate for women's and civil rights. One of Jackie's most important contributions was her support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Her advocacy for civil rights and her work to increase diversity within the White House staff are important contributions that continue to have an impact on society today. In my opinion, Jacqueline Kennedy is a fascinating figure who has made a profound impact on women that can still be seen in today's world. She not only was an eloquent, sophisticated first lady, but also a powerful force in shaping the image of what a first lady and a woman should be.
Thank you very much for that women's perspective on Jackie Kennedy, Ashley. Putting together that segment, what do you think you found most surprising about Jackie Kennedy?
I was surprised that she was the first of 9 women to hold a college degree, first ladies in the White House. And I was, even more surprised that not that many first ladies have held a college degree.
Especially in the mid-20th century. John Kennedy was the first president born in the 20th century. I presume Jackie would have been the first lady born in the 20th century.
Yes, she was born in 1929. She was much younger than him. Jackie Kennedy, knowingly or unknowingly, was able to do something fantastically well. To give just a little bit more context is the world these people come from, Mark. Her sister's name was Caroline, her only sister, also a socialite. They named their daughter Caroline. Her husband's name was John. They named their son John. They had a son named Patrick Bouvier who didn't live. They're just like the monarchs, Mark. They name their children after their relatives because it's as important to them that the first name of prior family members by marriage or not, carries on. And she was able to take this kind of ridiculous high society nature and turn herself and pivot and present herself a certain way, whether authentically or not, to the housewives of the late 50s, early 60s. And so my question for Ashley is, why do you think, as a mother, that she was able to connect so well in that time frame to working mothers? Because in the end, she was a working mother. The first lady is a job.
She not only was a working mother, but she also was a wife as well. And she handled those roles very well, and she juggled them. I think women could relate to her easily because she did all of it. And she did it with class and grace and style. And I think that women looked up to her because they could relate to her. She also had a career in journalism before becoming the first ladies. I really think that a lot of women could relate to her.
One of the things that I noticed, you use the word restoration of the White House, which is an important distinction to make because the refrain that gets repeated is that Jackie redecorated the White House. And this is important because what most people don't know or don't remember is that the White House was completely rebuilt under the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower. They gutted the entire thing, put in all the secret subfloors and all the secret bat caves, but also put in modern electricity and telephone, etc. So when the Kennedys inherited the White House, the inside of it looked like a drab government building. She didn't just go in and change the drapes. She turned the White House into a museum. And in that sense, Jackie would have been the curator of the White House. And she brought back all of these artifacts or sourced artifacts that had either previously been in the White House or belonged to previous residents of the White House or other important historical figures.
Well, yeah, not only that, Mark. She had her husband get with Congress and for the first time get the White House declared a museum to get congressional funding. Because up until then, and this was a dispute between her and her husband, the White House belongs to the public. And so when you went there, you had to pay for the stuff you wanted there as president. So John Kennedy actually had to go to his chief of staff and say, hey, please tell my wife that I'm going broke here.
Exactly.
And so she came back with, okay, well, you're the president. Why don't you go get the Congress to give us the money for it then? And that's how this happened, is it was an internal family household dispute about how much money we're spending on furniture. And this is also something the public could relate to. And from what I had come up with, and maybe Ashley would have some comments on this as well, was the women of that era, once they saw Jackie Kennedy redo the White House, became very inspired. So there was this whole sea of women and housewives started redecorating their house with the means they had, inspired by Jacqueline Kennedy redoing her house, which just happened to be the White House.
I do know she put together a committee actually, and that committee helped raise funds to redecorate the White House and to help gather antiques to put in the White House.
Right. So she was overcoming the president's objection to her spending his money. And she said, okay, pal, if you're not going to, spend household money on this, I'll raise the money myself. So she's very determined. And also, it can't be underestimated, the style that she had. She was very influenced by her trips overseas, especially to France, and going to state dinners over there and looking at the palaces over there and the government infrastructure as far as housing and hosting these international events. And she brought back to the White House, because prior to Jackie Kennedy doing all this, when you went to dinner at the White House or there was a summit meeting between world leaders there, like Mark said, it was very drab. It was like going to an undecorated hotel. So she brought that level of world sophistication to it and entertainment to it. So when heads of state were hosted, it was a very comfortable setting to them.
The White House now has a palatial feel, whereas before it was very much like a prison or even a military barracks. If you go into a military barracks today or a military office building, that was what the White House looked like pre-1961. What impact did Jackie have on, if any, on domestic or foreign policy in the years 1961 and 1962?
It wasn't a whole lot. There were several reasons for that. She was dealing with two young children in the White House, dealing with the Page Six gossip magazines and articles about her husband having numerous affairs with well-known people such as Marilyn Monroe. And also, 2.5 years in, she became pregnant and had a rough pregnancy and had stepped completely away from First Lady duties to deal with what would end up being the pregnancy where Patrick Bouvier was born and then died 2 days later. She didn't have a lot of time outside of being a wife, a mother, redecorating the White House to do much of anything, as far as all that goes. Quietly behind the scenes, she was really heavily involved in pushing her husband and her brother-in-law, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, on the civil rights issues.
So she was more of an Abigail Adams.
More Abigail Adams behind the scene, Eleanor Roosevelt behind the scenes, going to FDR, pushing New Deal programs to the poor and things of that nature. But what she really did was, and there was a pause here, there's a generational pause. She laid the groundwork for 30 years later for former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, to come in as the First Lady and walk in the door as a political force, modeling herself. Hillary Clinton modeled herself after Jackie Kennedy, that I can be, a woman, a mother, the First Lady, but also a political force in my own right. And she got that, Hillary Clinton got that from the fact that Jackie Kennedy was really committed to civil rights. And what that means to us now, when you look back, is this is the precursor to the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, the precursor to the late 60s civil rights movement, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Behind the scenes, she was heavily pushing her husband to get more involved in that. Now, whether or not he'd have done that without her is unknown to history. But we do know for a fact that she was heavily pushing him and Robert Kennedy to do more than that they were doing.
We'll take a break and come back and talk about 1963.
Stone Forge.
Handcrafted, made-to-order carbon steel knives from Stone Forge at Facebook.com. Mention Cousin Eddie when you place your order and receive a 10% discount.
Stone Forge.
Whether you are preparing meals in the kitchen, in the field, or adding to your collection, a full-tang handcrafted knife from Stone Forge delivers the performance, presentation, and durability that you expect from premium cutlery.
Stone Forge.
Each knife is handcrafted from specialty carbon steel, then sharpened and polished by hand to deliver long-lasting performance, and includes a matching custom handle made from premium specie hardwood.
Stone Forge.
Also included with your purchase of a handcrafted carbon steel knife from Stone Forge is a unique leather sheath for safe handling and protection of your premium Stone Forge knife.
Stone Forge.
Custom carbon steel knives from Stone Forge make great gifts. Chefs, hunters, collectors, and enthusiasts alike all enjoy receiving their very own handcrafted knife from Stone Forge.
Stone Forge at facebook.com.
All Stone Forge products are made in the USA. Product specifications may be limited by the laws of your jurisdiction. Get yours today by searching for Stone Forge at facebook.com.
Stone Forge at facebook.com.
Mention Cousin Eddie when you place your order and receive a 10% discount. Visit Stone Forge at facebook.com.
Stone Forge at facebook.com.
And we're back with Jackie B. entering the year 1963. John Kennedy is facing a tough re-election campaign, having squeaked into the Oval Office on a thin margin in 1960's election. Jack is now facing an equally tough, if not tougher, campaign trail ahead of him. Meanwhile, Jackie Kennedy is facing another difficult pregnancy, and that's where we pick up 1963, James.
Well, Mark, coming into the political year of 1963, the Kennedys were in trouble. When I say Kennedys, there's two versions. There's the Kennedy family, which would be Jack and Jackie and their children. That's their family. But when I say the Kennedys, I speak of them as a political organization. At this point, they're in full ramp-up mode for re-election, and they're in trouble. They have lost the South, more or less, because of segregation, because of Bobby Kennedy not only threatening but sending the military down to the Deep South to desegregate schools and other things that we'll get into on another show that drain the Kennedy political base from the South, which is what he rode to election in 1960, as every Democrat candidate since the Civil War was forced to do. But in leaving the political base in the South behind, they had gained traction in California and the upper Northeast, which Kennedy needed. But what he needed more than anything, Mark, because Texas in 1964 was one of the biggest electoral states, and they barely carried it in 1960 due to Vice President Lyndon Johnson's influence, and they had to have it. If they don't get Texas in 64, they're finished. So what was happening in the state of Texas, in the political machine there was a political divide was being created between Governor Conley, Senator Yarborough, Lyndon Johnson. There was the conservative wing, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. It doesn't exist anymore, but it did then. And there was infighting going on.
So not unlike today's divide within the Republican Party.
Very similar. And you're going to see this play out in modern times. But back then, this was the beginning of the fracture of the Democratic Party. After this fracture takes place, you move on and a lot of them become Republicans, and then the others become liberal Democrats. Governor John Conley, the sitting governor of Texas in 63, was a Democrat. He would switch to be Republican 10 years later. But this was the beginning of it. And Kennedy knew he was in deep trouble. Deep trouble. So he calls up Lyndon, his vice president, and insert a Boston accent here. Hey, Lyndon, buddy, help me out in Texas. So Lyndon gets on the phone with all the political donators and the power base and Senator Yarborough and Governor Conley and says, hey, we're coming to town. And it's Lyndon's idea to say, hey, look, let's just go to Texas in the fall. Right? We'll sit down, we'll get everyone on the same page, we'll do fundraisers, we'll let the political base in Texas see you, Mr. President. Right? But Mr. President, I'm not sure it's going to work. And this is where John did one of the most politically savage things in the history of the Republic. As his wife is going through this rough pregnancy, Mrs. Kennedy, the First Lady, he starts selling her on the idea of becoming politically involved and campaigning with him. Something she refused to do throughout their marriage because she did not want to be political and she did not want to be used by her husband. Right? The reason, Mark, that everyone said the Kennedys looked like actors and actresses back then is because they were. They were acting like they had a happy marriage. They were using photographs of their children to present the perfect American family to the voting bloc. And Mrs. Kennedy knew this. And she was not playing ball until finally Jack said, look, we're going to lose. We have to go to Texas. We have to go to the South. And I really need your help. What happens then as we tick forward through the summer, her pregnancy becomes very unstable, according to reports at the time, newspaper articles. And in August of 63, in the summer, Mrs. Kennedy gives birth to Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, who unfortunately, tragically, after 2 days of life, dies. Mrs. Kennedy, shortly after, goes with her sister, Carolyn, to an island off the coast of Greece to recuperate and deal with the trauma and the toll that took on her. Which leads me to a question I have for Ashley. It would just be a couple months later that Mrs. Kennedy would return and then go on this political campaign tour to Texas. It's always been almost unbelievable to me that someone could go through what she went through and then put on such a face 2 months later. My question for you is, how do you think she did that, Ashley?
Well, from a woman's perspective, I think she had to do what she had to do. There was no point of her sitting there complacent and not moving forward with what she had to do. She was a very strong woman.
Well said.
And also from the woman's perspective, it's been rumored that before Mrs. Kennedy, Ashley, before she would agree to go on this political tour with her husband, become more political, get involved with the campaign, and allow her husband to use her and her living children as props, that she told him, I will do this, but you must become committed to our marriage. It must be you, me, and the children, and us only. Now, that's a rumor. Do you think that would actually be applicable, that she could forgive him so quickly if he promised to change?
That's a hard question. I think she would do that. If the scandals were released, photographed, or there was some sort of evidence of him basically cheating on her, it would look bad. And then it would put him in a position to potentially lose the race. I think she was protecting their family, protecting herself, and protecting the race for election. I think it was a possibility that she could have said that.
There is no doubt she loved him. She would not have been the first woman nor the last to love a man who would step outside the marriage romantically. It's unclear whether or not he loved her, but she clearly loved him. And for her to be a success in that time frame and to protect her children, he had to be a success. And so I've theorized that the reason she agreed, and this is just strictly my opinion, is she wasn't going to let the fact that he was doing what he was doing destroy her family publicly. And if that meant campaigning, that meant campaigning. And to me, that's another check in the box of just how badass this woman was, is that she was willing to overlook this to not have national world public embarrassment upon her family.
That's as good a guess as any, I would say. These families live for their reputations and for their social connections. Their personal feelings were often secondary to the primary goals of maintaining family integrity. So that's probably a hypothesis that best fits the facts. What we're getting to is that Jackie didn't want to be in Dallas. She hadn't been on the campaign trail with her husband prior to that date in Dallas, and now Dallas becomes a tragic irony.
Well, it does. She hadn't been on the campaign trail, but she had traveled with the president overseas, in particular, most famously to France, where she spent time as a child. And the President Kennedy, famously remarked, I'm the man accompanying Mrs. Kennedy to Paris, because she was so vastly popular there. And that was in the back of his mind, and then becomes in the front of his mind in 63, and his political advisors. Hey, Mr. President, you remember how much of a star Jackie was? Let's make her a star in America. So as the fall of 1963 approaches, the Dallas trip is announced in September. Jackie returns from her, I don't want to call it sabbatical, but from her recovery overseas, and joins John Kennedy on the trip to Dallas. The trip starts out, it's supposed to be a 2.5-day trip. They fly into Austin the day before. They do an event there. They go on to Fort Worth. They stayed the night there on November 22nd, 1963. And in the morning, she was supposed to attend with her husband a meeting with the Chamber of Commerce that her husband would give a speech at. This turns out to be the last speech she would ever give. Now, the crowds in Texas were so overwhelmingly positive to the president that it was the reverse of public opinion that everyone thought would happen when they went there. And that was due to Jackie. Jackie was like the Beatles, or modern day, she was like Lady Gaga or Taylor Swift. Right? And so as they're waiting for Jackie to attend the breakfast speech, the time's going on and the time's going on. So President Kennedy, as witty as he was, stands up before the Chamber of Commerce and 2,000 people and says, well, it takes Mrs. Kennedy a little bit longer to get arranged than Lyndon and myself, but it's well worth the wait. The crowd erupts. Mrs. Kennedy then makes her way through the crowd with that pink dress that's become famous and that hat. And as she gets to the podium, Kennedy remarks, I was once mentioned as the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris, and I'm getting that same sensation now here in Texas. They would then fly the short 15 minutes flight to Dallas, arriving in Dallas just before noon. They would motorcade and parade through downtown Dallas, through hundreds of thousands of onlookers and well-wishers. And Mark, I'll let you tell the audience how this trip ended up.
We all know how the trip ended up. It ended with Jackie Kennedy retrieving a portion of her husband's skull off the trunk of the vehicle that they were riding in. And, of course, the president being declared dead shortly thereafter, and a nation enters shock and mourning. You have to remember that society back then was very much different, deference to government. There was a lot more faith in government, and people felt a personal connection to the holder of the office of President of the United States, regardless of who it was, many more so because it was John Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy. You have this tragedy that occurs. We'll end this segment with Jackie Kennedy on the plane waiting for Lyndon Johnson to take the oath of office before they take off and return to Washington. She was offered to clean up and change her dress, and she said, no, I want them to see what they've done to Jack. Jacobin. It's not a law, but it is a great idea. Call or text 830-JACOBIN anytime. If we like what you have to say, we'll discuss your comments on the air. If we don't like what you have to say, you'll hear about that too. 830-JACOBIN. It's not a law, but it should be. Welcome back to Jackie B. We're going to switch things up a bit and talk about an upcoming series that the Jacobin brothers will be presenting about the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. It is entitled LHO versus JFK. This will be a multi-part series evaluating and analyzing voluminous evidence compiled by a number of governmental commissions as well as independent and private investigators. And we will make the final determination, James, you and I, on who, what, how, and why John F. Kennedy was killed on that fateful day. That should close the issue, and then we can move on to other things.
Yeah, I think maybe we could write a book about it called Case Closed, and then everyone else would just get in line and believe us. It'd be over. Or a pitchy title covering the timeline in Dallas, say 6 seconds in Dallas, something like that.
Something like that. To get us into the topic as well as the audience engaged, James, we're going to talk about the movie JFK, released in 1991, directed by Oliver Stone, which created a firestorm domestically and internationally at that point in time, led to yet the formation of another government investigatory body. Leaving the veracity of the film for another topic, such as which things did they get right historically and which things did they invent, we're going to talk about the film as a cinematic experience. We asked our guest commentator, Ashley, to watch the film. She did so recently, so we'll open it with you, Ashley. What were your impressions of that?
I really enjoyed it. Thought it really put it in, all the potential viewpoint into perspective for the public, and I really think it got people thinking about the possibilities surrounding the assassination of JFK.
Assuming that everything in the film was correct, as a grand jury would if they were to indict anyone, what did you think was most revealing about the film in terms of storytelling?
I mean, you can't argue the actual footage. I think the timeline of events and the actual interviews of people, I think that was really, really important in shaping shaping the film.
Okay, so a compound question. Prior to viewing the film, did you have any ideas about or interest in who might have killed the president? After watching the film, did you form new ideas or have changed ideas?
I actually did not really have never questioned anything about his assassination. Afterwards, it reminded me to be open-minded about things and to really take all the facts in from every perspective, and it definitely changed what I thought before, and which was basically nothing, and I accept the explanation that everyone can find, online. And afterwards, it got me thinking about things.
After watching the film, and based solely on your experience watching the film, would you tend to think that Oswald acted alone of his own volition, or that he might have been part of a larger group of individuals?
I think there were several people. I don't think it was just one person.
And there you have it. James, as a film, what's your opinion of it?
Oh, it's a remarkable film. It's truly remarkable. It does what every good film should do. The opening scene brings you right in. They show the motorcade turn in that corner on Elm Street. They blended the Zapruder film with filming footage and made it look seamless. And the second you hear that first shot, the screen goes to black, the pigeons fly off the school book depository building, and it cuts right to New Orleans and Kevin Costner looking up. By that point in the movie, you're a minute in, and you're already in the story. Beyond that, the flashbacks, the black and white scenes, the voiceovers, where you're really thinking you're in the room with these people in a black and white fashion or a current fashion, the editing, and the story itself. It's the ultimate whodunit, the ultimate mystery, tremendous cast. And I have to tell you, upon viewing this for the first time 30 some odd years ago, by the end of it, Mark Jacobin, I was convinced that Tommy Lee Jones, Gary Oldman, and Kevin Bacon had killed the president.
Bastards.
That damn Tommy Lee Jones.
There was always something funny about him. And you're right. As a piece of filmmaking, the production values are absolutely off. Period settings, the set pieces, the costumes, for the most part. The accents, of course, are never authentic, but they were believable enough they didn't take you out of the film.
Well, they take you into New Orleans in that era, right? And they show you the underbelly of it, and they show you the glamour of it, and the political corruption of it. And by the time, I think, in the third act, when we get to Kevin Costner's character meeting with Donald Sutherland on a bench in the Washington, D.C. district with all the memorials in the background and the music and the flashbacks, you're so involved in the movie right then, you're not even thinking you're looking at actors. At least I wasn't. This seemed to me almost to be a documentary of fact that was taking place, that you were just seeing a recording of conversations that were taking place. Like I said, the film itself has led to numerous pop culture quotes, some of the most quoted scenes in the history of modern cinema, such as, Back and to the Left, Who Owns Bell, and numerous others. Launches the career of Gary Oldman, solidifies the A-list status of Tommy Lee Jones. Kevin Costner's already in the stratosphere. Oliver Stone was already a legend of the 80s in filmmaking. This was the pinnacle of a lot of their careers, and it was the pinnacle of filmmaking. Now, I'll leave it at that as far as the veracity of the movie being truthful. Excellent entertainment.
Excellent. A-list actors all throughout, or emerging A-list actors. You had an outstanding performance from John Candy, which was very much against type. You had Joe Pesci, who does a phenomenal job. All the more phenomenal when you realize that he probably had to do every take 10 or 15 times, because that's what you do in a film. He was just schizophrenic in that role.
The Sissy Spacek character, playing the wife of Kevin Costner, the wife of the Jim Garrison character, really being the conscience of the movie. She's looking at it as we are. I think the Sissy Spacek character is us, the audience, because she's questioning Kevin Costner. Why are you doing this? Why can't you let it go? And he says, well, the truth, and it's important to know whether or not we've been lied to. And she comes back with, well, what about our family? And he says, well, no one's family means anything more or less if this is true. And so it really walks all these fine lines. And yeah, getting back to the Joe Pesci scene, the emotional breakdown he has in the hotel room when the character asks him, well, who killed the president? He spits out his car. He's like, who killed the president? It's an enigma wrapped up in a blah, blah, blah. The shooters don't even know, right? And you as the audience, you're like, oh my God, what's going on here? Because you're believing everything, right? and you're relating to the stress Joe Pesci's under, right? Or his character's under.
We would encourage everybody to watch the film, at least for certain historical reference points. There are a number of areas where the film takes certain dramatic liberties, as all films do. So we certainly wouldn't represent it as a fact-based presentation. However, when compared side by side with Braveheart, I would say JFK is somewhat more historically accurate.
The tagline of that movie, Mark, the marketing on the movie poster, of course, the movie's title is JFK, and the tagline was "The Story That Won't Go Away." Now, this movie's released 30-some-odd years ago, and we're about to embark on a 10 to 15-part series covering it yet again. So I agree with the tagline. The story won't go away, and it probably never will.
Look for LHO versus JFK debuting in January.
Well, Ashley, thanks for joining us. You were the first guest commentator or guest host. I don't even know what to call us, Mark. We're just two guys talking. But great job. Thanks for all the work you put in. Both understand and appreciate you for all the time and effort you put in. And thanks for joining us. And once you get your podcast started there in the local town that you're in, we're going to be happy to publicize that here on Truth in Our Lives and the way that we can. And we wish you the best of luck, and thanks for your contribution today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I had a lot of fun.
Before we go, something that's been on my mind. Of course, the president's name was John. He went by the nickname of Jack. His wife's name was Jacqueline. She went by the nickname of Jack. Do you suppose in the bedroom at night they would take turns between who would be Jack and who would be Jackie?
Well, I would say they were 2 generations ahead of the self-gender identification process, that's for sure. I'm sure that, well, never mind. I'm going to...
You've been listening to Truth and Other Lies